In full transparency, this podcast series was originally entitled America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. I recorded the first 3 episodes before the election on November 5th. Even though the polling had the presidential race tied, I never thought this country would put Trump back into office, especially after January 6th and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Well, I've never been so wrong. So with the election of Donald J. Trump on November 5th, 2024, I changed the title of this podcast to Trump's America, because whether you like it or not, we are living in Trump's America. I didn't want to throw the first 3 episodes into the trash. I thought they were really great conversations that I wanted to share with you. So forgive me on a couple of questions that are not relevant anymore, but I hope you enjoy the 95% of each episode that is extremely relevant in our current reality. Thank you. Welcome to America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. I'm your host, Mick Larson. Today's podcast guest is Dr. Frank McAndrew. Frank is a professor of psychology at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. He has twice received the Philip Green Wright Lombard College Prize for distinguished teaching. Frank's book, Environmental Psychology, has been translated into several languages and is recognized as a classic text in the history of that discipline. You may have seen Frank on all the major networks and cable channels discussing his work on mass shooters, gossip, and creepiness. I've been looking forward to having Frank on, so let's do this. Welcome, Frank. I introduced you in the open on the podcast, but why don't you tell the folks the areas of work you've done in your career and what are you working on now currently?
Well, I've been kind of a jack of all trades in my career. I started off as an experimental psychologist who studied animals, but over time I've morphed into first a social psychologist and then an evolutionary social psychologist, which basically means I'm interested in social interaction, but I'm also interested in looking at it through the lens of evolution. In other words, we are the kind of beings our ancestors needed to be successful in prehistoric times. And a lot of the problems and interesting stuff we have today is the mismatch we now have between the caveman brains we're walking around with and the modern world that we're not necessarily prepared to deal with.
We'll definitely get into that. Um, what do you think about my idea that there needs to be a second Reconstruction in America? And I say that I think this is a real inflection point in our history and also in current affairs. We had an insurrection, we had an attack on the Capitol, something that the Confederacy didn't even do, which is a nod to the people that say authoritarian regimes usually get elected into power and not by force. The level of polarization and misinformation along with disinformation is likely at all-time high thanks to the internet. AI is coming, if it's not already here, obviously. Income inequality and the structure of our economy as well as tax policy, in my view, are not sustainable the way they are in the long run. It just feels like we need to do a lot of work. We need a fully functioning Republican Party. We need, solutions, not division. So does that qualify in your mind as a reconstruction or where we need to go from here?
Well, I think it certainly qualifies as a goal to strive for, but I think we have a serious problem. The infrastructure that's making all of this stuff possible is very firmly in place now. And if anything, it's only getting stronger. And by that, I mean the internet and the fact that we can silo ourselves into our respective worldviews. The downside, one of the downsides of this is it makes us feel smarter than we actually are. It used to be we all saw the same news programs. We had different opinions and we could argue about stuff, but we all were starting from the same common knowledge base. We all sort of knew the same thing. We may not have agreed about how much we liked that or whether we wanted to change it or not, but there was agreement about what it was. But now we can spend our whole day watching things on the internet or cable news channels where we only hear what we want to hear. And we hear all of these people agreeing with us. And that makes us feel pretty smart. And we're drawn to that. There is something called a confirmation bias. We actively seek information that we are right about stuff. And we avoid and disparage anything that challenges us. And it used to be harder to avoid that than it is now. You can very easily just defriend people, just tune into the cable networks that you want to watch. And when you do see opposing point of views in this ecosystem, you're seeing them being attacked and shredded. So it's not like you're getting another point of view. What you're getting is another point of view being dismantled in front of you. And that makes you even more secure that what you're exposed to is the right stuff. So,
Yeah.
yeah, as long as that's in place, I don't know how we get ourselves out of this hole.
Well, we'll get into that later too, as far as what we need to do next. This is kind of a big question, but if you had to explain to your incoming freshmen in some of your classes what happened to the country during the Trump era, how would you try to explain that?
Well, I think the infrastructure of siloed information was already in place. I think the buttons that Trump and his cronies have pushed is dredged up some of our strongest prehistoric inclinations and really played on them. And the ones that come to mind first is the distinction we make between in groups and out groups. In our prehistoric past, it was if you were ostracized from your group, it was a death sentence. You were not going to make it on your own. So there was a very strong pressure for conformity, for loyalty to the group. People in that group needed to feel like they could trust you, that you had their back. You were not going to cheat or swindle them. And so there's this strong need for loyalty. And even today, we make a big distinction between our in group and out groups. Our in group is better, right? I mean, our values are more moral. We are smarter and just more desirable in every way. And this sets the stage for if you're going to set up a tense situation between your group and another group, the premium is going to be on I've got to be loyal to my group. And I've got to be really cautious and vigilant about these other groups. Now, these other groups can be immigrants. They can be people of other races. If you want to keep it in the political arena, they can be people in our party or not. Are they rhinos, Republicans in name only? Can we truly trust them? And so the battle lines are drawn. And I think more than anything, that's what's gotten us into trouble. This strong God is on our side allegiance and loyalty to our group. It's kind of like professional sports teams, right? You follow this team and you love the team and you root against the quarterback from the other team. But then he gets traded to your team. Now he's on your team. So you support him, even though you didn't used to like him at all. We do the same thing with politicians. I think people who say they don't support Trump and Vance and the MAGA movement in general, damn it, it's still our team. And the idea that we're going to be a turncoat, that's why people like Liz Cheney are so ostracized by their former party. They've committed the worst sin.
Yes, criticizing the group from within,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they kicked her out.
Yeah, absolutely.
That brings up so to from that theory of evolutionary psychology that MAGA became or is an identity for folks, and it's hard to attack. It's hard to attack an identity. Can you talk
Yes.
about that a little bit?
Sure, because it becomes who you are, not just what you happen to believe or what your opinions are. And so when people start disagreeing with each other over these issues, they become identity issues. If I hear somebody disparaging my political position, what I'm really hearing is them telling me that I'm stupid, that my values are inferior to their values, that my religion or whatever I hold dear is not being respected. And so it's hard to compromise in that situation.
Is there a way? How do you tactfully, you know, um, whoever is president is going to say they're the president for everybody,
Yeah.
and obviously public policy is for everybody. It doesn't care whether you're Republican or Democrat, it's whether you qualify for it or what have you. Um, what's the way out of this conundrum, this
Well,
polarization that we're in?
if I had the answer for that, I'd be collecting my Nobel Peace Prize, I think, as we speak. But I think somehow we've got to get ourselves out of this notion that uh, the person who disagrees with us is evil. It was not as bad when we simply thought of them as being sort of misguided. And maybe if we gave them a little more information or made a stronger argument that we could win them over. The rhetoric that gets used now by politicians, the enemy within, the evil, sick, deranged people on the other side, we have to root them out. They hate America, they hate you. Uh, this demonization sort of gives you permission to do whatever you need to do to deal with them, right? I mean, if they're evil and you're opposed to them, that means you're good. And we've got to make sure that good triumphs over evil. So
Um,
I think if you're having a conversation with individuals one-on-one, the way you've got to start is to first show that you do understand the other's position. I know we disagree about this, and I understand why you might think X, Y, and Z. Um, but let me kind of explain why I don't. And don't go right after them, you idiot. How can you believe that? Right away, it's over. You're not going to get anywhere.
right. Um, I don't know. This is just my take on it, but it's like you start with Rush Limbaugh and you start with, and then go into Fox News, and then you get a Donald Trump that um, is hijacking, using hate and fear to hijack for political expediency, um, and creating this division within. It's to solve this problem. Don't we have to have leaders that say this is not the way to go about it? Whether you agree or disagree on tax policy, there's a better way. Is that what we need? Is better leadership?
Well, yes, but I think we have enough people saying that now in positions of leadership, and it doesn't seem to be moving the needle very much because
Right.
right away we've been hoodwinked into thinking these people have an agenda. Sure, they're saying all of this compromisey stuff, but they're part of the conspiracy. They're part of the deep state. Of course, that's what they're going to tell us. It's just another ploy on their part to screw us in the end. So the suspicion levels are so high that, I'm really at a loss to know how to break through that. And I think it's happening on both sides. We tend to focus on the MAGA movement and their reaction against the left. But if I get in a room full of my most left-wing friends, the names of the people change, but the characterization of what's going on the opposite side, the evil, the stupid, it all sounds sort of the same.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you know, political ideology is like a horseshoe, right? Most
Mm,
of us is are in the bottom
yep.
half, and your extremes on the left, your extremes on the right, on the top of the horseshoe, and both are just very ideological, and they don't accept compromise.
Yep. And when we're tuning into our news channels or internet sites, we're seeing the two ends of the horseshoe. That's what we're kind of drawn to, because otherwise it's kind of boring, right? It's this wishy-washy on the one hand, on the other hand, whereas if you're just speaking from the extremes, you can be fired up, you can have the sense of righteous indignation that gets people riled up. There's another personality trait psychologists talk about that we're really lacking these days, and I think the internet has made it worse. Are you familiar with the concept of intellectual humility?
No, mm-mm. But yeah,
Uh,
I imagine we need more of it.
yeah, think of it this way. Think about all of the disagreements that you've had with somebody in the last 6 months. And then what percentage of the time do you think you were right? If you're like most people,
I go with 100% over here,
well, yeah, the number is not going to be small, right?
which I say we need less certainty.
Yeah. Well, and this turns out to be a thing. This is sort of a personality trait. And people who are high in intellectual humility are more willing to at least be open to the possibility that they're wrong. And more than that, they're actually quite interested in why people disagree with them. They're interested in finding out, okay, you don't believe this, but I want to know what you're thinking here. If you're low in intellectual humility, you're not interested in that at all. If you disagree with me, you're an idiot. And that's really all I need to know. And that's kind of a showstopper. And one of the problems if you're a politician who's low in intellectual humility, which by the way, I don't think very many of them are, uh, you're going to be perceived as a flip-flopper, right? You're open to new information. You're open to changing your mind. You
Like
might
facts.
be, yeah, you're a flip-flopper. And what could be worse than being a flip-flopper, right? I mean, they're accusing people of, hey, 10 years ago, you said this. Now you're saying that. How could anybody vote for you? It's weird that we're in a position where if somebody learns something new and upgrades their opinion to accommodate that, they're vilified for that.
It's like the movie, the dude says, man, some new information has come to light, It's like you've got to be, and that's, I guess that's the problem with, COVID was that, science changes and
Mhm.
we knew nothing about COVID and we are just making stuff up, best what we know, here's what we should do based on what we know. And as time goes on, that changes and everybody goes, oh, what is that all about? They said this and now they're saying that. So that's disappointing that people don't get that about science.
Yes, it is. And there's a total lack of respect for expertise, for want of a better way to say it. Ask any physician about how much time they spend arguing with the patients who spend 20 minutes on the internet looking something up and think they know more about what needs to be done here than the physician does. Or if you're a financial advisor who's been doing this for a couple of decades and really know your stuff, again, somebody comes in after looking at something on the internet and your expertise counts for nothing. And yeah, and you're right. People don't understand. Okay, once you don't respect expertise, then your opinion is as good as anyone else's. And they don't understand how science works. And the COVID is a perfect example. Yeah, based on the information we have at the moment, here's what we're recommending. If it turns out 6 months later that, well, that was not necessary, it wasn't true, it just confirms scientists don't know what they're talking about. Why should I listen to them?
Yeah. Another great saying I like is if you want to, you have to be open to being wrong if you're open to learning. And so you've always got to have that openness that you're talking about so that you can actually take in new information
Mhm.
and reassess basically. Um, you know, America is a nation of immigrants, and scapegoating immigrants, which it's kind of ironic. Scapegoating immigrants is nothing new in American history, but it seemed like Trump was very transparent in those attacks on immigrants and people that didn't agree with him, as well as women. What's your thoughts on why it became just he was giving a permission structure like you already mentioned, but I'm just curious why it was okay for him to be that bold and that transparent about his, vilification of immigrants.
Well, I think that's part of his appeal to people. I don't think he's the smartest guy around, but he's got a good feel for knowing what's going to move people. And if people are walking around suspicious of outsiders, afraid of their future getting taken away by someone else, they think of life as a zero-sum game, right? If immigrants are getting something, that must mean something's being taken away from me, which is not the case, but that's it's easy to fall into that trap. And what he's done is sort of give people permission to express their darkest, most racist opinions that maybe 20 years ago they were still walking around with, but they knew it was kind of uncool to say it. And the fact that Trump is breaking the rules, they see it as refreshing. Hey, it's about time somebody stood up to whoever those people are that are making us feel bad about ourselves.
Well, comes to women's reproductive health care in our country, and was basically reversed by 50 years under Trump and the Supreme Court. What do you think that is all about?
Well, again, it's, about control, but it's also it, it's very telling about the lack of nuance in positions. I think most pro-lifers, people who are, very much against abortion, tend to think of it in a very simplified way, right? You've got women behaving loosely and not wanting to pay the consequences for that, and so they're aborting children. All of this stuff that's come up about these women going through these terrible, well, they're dying as a
Yes.
result of not being able to get health care. That kind of nuance was totally non-existent in people's minds. I mean, all they were thinking is, okay, they're killing babies. End of story. We don't need to know anything else. But the different
The
ways that this
reality.
could, yeah, the reality is so much more complicated. And I think if you talk to most of these people one-on-one about, well, what do you think of this situation? What do you think of that? They're going to say, well, yeah, this is wrong. Those people should be able to get that care, but the snowball is rolling down the hill. And yeah,
Well, I would say all this is all about male mating strategies and controlling women. To me, it's that simple. I mean, I'm doing a documentary about it, but it's like the 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 women that had two children, they were having their third, they wanted to have this child. Wasn't like you said, the simply like someone's being loose or whatever, and didn't use birth control, what have you. But these families are trying to add to their family, welcome these children into the world, and something goes wrong. And like at least in Texas, and perhaps maybe in Florida too, but they'd rather see her die than get an abortion. And to me, that is a red flag for like this is about control. This is not about the
yeah.
fetus. What are your
Well,
thoughts on
and
that?
you're also painting yourself into a corner if you have already made these pronouncements about the evil of these things. Even giving a little on that um, is going to be hard to do because you've made the statement this is wrong, and you're not going to condone anything that you consider to be wrong. But I don't disagree with you about the male control. It's the again, going back to our caveman ancestors, the problem has always been mama's baby, papa's maybe. The woman always knows that a child is hers. The man can only hope, and therefore we need to, as men, make sure we know what our women are up to all the time. That's why you have so many societies where women can't show themselves. They can't go outside of the house without a male relative with them, because the worst thing, evolutionarily speaking, for a male would be to be investing resources and time into raising kids that aren't his. And maybe the only way to make sure that doesn't happen is to, keep the women locked away. Now, the abortion thing, um, again, if the woman is pregnant with your child, then you have a very strong interest in making sure that child gets born. But the thing that's always been curious to me is if the woman is pregnant and you suspect the child isn't yours, then
Right.
that's a different story.
You should be, yeah, you should be pro abort, or pro choice
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, and that's why you find all these hypocritical politicians who are saying one thing, and then you find out, oh, well, they had a girlfriend and they encouraged her to get this abortion. So yeah, it's pretty slimy.
Um, Looking at your research into, mass shooters and how they profile, there seems to be some overlap with a certain kind of American, I'm not saying um, they're all MAGA folks, but this feeling of being disaffected, being a disaffected Trump voter is what we hear in the media. Um, is there any overlap with those guys and that feeling? And
I think
like you said,
so.
politics is very much about feeling.
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely think the feeling of being disrespected is a very powerful motivator, especially for men. And the mass shooters, before I segue back into the the politics of it. For the most part, what is the profile you hear in the news as soon as one of these happens? They don't say, guess what the captain of the football team just did, or guess what the president of the student body just did. No, when they describe the person, you hear words like a loner, uh, odd, somebody who is bullied, always somebody on the fringes who was not respected or taken seriously by anyone. And this is the explosion of violence as a way to show, God damn it, I am to be taken seriously. I am a person of consequence. You're going to know who I am. And depending upon whether there's ideology involved, it plays out in different ways. If it's if it's sort of a local thing, okay, I'm going around feeling disrespected and marginalized. I go back to the school that made me feel that way. I go back to the workplace where I was bullied or belittled. And that's where I make my statement in a very personal way. With ideology, it's much more, you just don't feel like anybody cares or knows about you. You feel powerless. And you get into this internet world where you start posting and expressing opinions. And for the first time, maybe people say, yeah, you know what you're talking about and you feel important. And when you see the people that they hate, what could be a better route to being somebody important than to go out there and show them you have the guts to do something about it? And so the mass shooter is driven by different things, but the lack of respect is the thing that's pushing them. Now, getting back to the whole MAGA movement, I think a lot of Trump's appeal, they've always wondered, well, how does this rich guy who went to Ivy League schools appeal to, these working class, non-college educated men? Well, for the simple reason that he seems to hate the same people they do. He seems to be sticking it to the people that look down on them and make fun of them, the Hollywood types who ridicule them on sitcoms, the academic elites who are on the talk shows, looking down their noses, or so they think, at these people. So Trump's appeal is, he's fighting their battles for them. Yeah, maybe he's got money and maybe, he went to one of those fancy schools, but deep down, and I think there's some people who have sort of analyzed Trump as feeling disrespected. Like, he grew up in New York, but he was never really accepted by the
Right.
powers that be there. He was always considered this outsider that was looked down on. And so in some ways, his behavior is driven by this need to be someone.
Well, he certainly spent a lot of time and energy before he even ran for office, trying to get in front of, newspapers and radio shows and TV. So he was, full bore on that.
Oh yeah. And the name Trump on building, I mean, wherever. Yes.
You know, what about, I mean, can you shed some light on why there is so much disinformation and even conspiracy theories coming from, a certain type of American, whether it's like Pizzagate or Sandy Hook or, the most recently, the FEMA hurricane relief conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Is there any way to explain that?
Well, I think that they spread like wildfire. Well, first of all, they keep getting repeated. There's something called the mere exposure effect. The more often you hear something, the more comfortable you get with it. And the more you start to think it's true, because if it wasn't true, they wouldn't be still saying it, right? It would have been debunked by now and it would have gone away. And if it hasn't gone away, then there must be something to it. And it's almost always something that confirms your opinion about certain people. So if you believe the Democrats or whoever they are evil, perverted, uh, out to get you, any conspiracy theory that gives you more evidence that that's going on and that it's true, you're going to gobble that right up. Whereas a conspiracy theory that goes against the grain, that is telling you something you don't want to hear, it's much easier to dismiss that as not true. I think it's interesting when people hear conflicting conspiracy theories, like, okay, when Princess Diana was killed, um, there were some conspiracy theories that said, well, the royal family had her murdered. But then there were other conspiracy theories that said she faked her own death so she could disappear and get out of the limelight. Well, you're not going to be able to believe both of those, right? I mean, you're going to have to choose sides there. So uh, the nice package of conspiracy theories are the ones that all feed into the same narrative, that people that you're suspicious of to begin with are even more sinister than you thought. And yeah, and even if you're, I mean, getting back to our conversation about COVID, something that always fascinated me was Trump could have taken credit for railroading this vaccine through in record time. He switched the levers on that threw the money at it, and it happened. And he would have had really something to brag about. Look, I got this vaccine, but what happened? He got the vaccine, and then it was, don't take it. It's
Even though he personally took it,
yes, oh yeah, and
all the
and
leaders in the Republican Party took it.
and some of his Cash Patel, I read something, I think it was in the Atlantic recently, where he even had a scheme where he was marketing some drug that would reverse the effects of a COVID vaccine. I mean, yeah, because there's a market for it.
As a society or culture, is there anything we can do about decreasing misinformation and disinformation, do you think?
I have to admit, I get kind of discouraged about this because they're short of getting rid of, going back to we need to go back to the day where everybody knew the same stuff. And I don't see how that's possible. The genie is out of the bottle. And, somehow, people need to start hearing other things from people they trust. Even if you tune into one of these other cable networks, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, I'll put Fox News on and I'll listen to it for 15 or 20 minutes. And right away, I'm dismissing everything I'm hearing and coming up with counter arguments. And I'm not really being as open-minded as I'd like to think I am when I'm looking at that. I don't know how we get people to make that
Or
additional step.
your BS radar is working really well.
Well, that's how I comfort myself, right? That's why it's okay to say this. But yeah, and when I have some conservative friends who occasionally will watch MSNBC, and they just can't believe the bullshit that they're hearing, yeah, because that's where they're coming from.
Right here's a theory for you, Mr. Psychologist. Um, I think because liberals believe in government and believe government can solve problems, and so they are invested in it. They want facts because it's hard to fix anything if you don't have the facts. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels or
Mhm.
going aimlessly anywhere. Um, the Republican Party for decades now is anti-government. Whether it be smaller or you know deregulation, what have you. But so it's created this atmosphere where you know I think the Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, Republican Party have succeeded in being like Russia, where you can't believe anything.
Yes.
And once you get everyone to think, well, this is just because a Democrat said it, it's false. Or if a Republican, but the thing is, I think Democrats do like facts. And I don't, obviously I'm making a gross generalization here, but I'm just saying liberals like facts because they want to fix things. And Republicans don't really care about facts because they don't really care about fixing anything. And I don't know if that's just an oversimplification, but that's kind of how I see that.
It's interesting when you hear talk about dismantling FEMA or the Department of Education or any of these other agencies because they're getting in the way of helping people and solving problems. There's never any suggestion about, well, if they're gone, how will we? And people seem okay with that. It's like, yeah, they're the problem. Let's get rid of them. It was kind of like when all the attempts at getting rid of Obamacare and replacing it. Well, the replacement part was always a problem, right? It was always 2 weeks from now, they're going to unveil a plan. And it just never happened.
And what did Trump say? Now he has a sketch of a plan or
A,
something?
a concept of a plan.
Well, yeah. Well, as far as the disinformation, misinformation, I do believe in free speech. You can say whatever you want in this country. I definitely believe in that. But I think there needs to be a consequence for lying or intentional misinformation, you know, how as a society or culture can we change the course that we're on? I mean, what ideas, anything?
Well, yeah, the misinformation, part of the problem is so much of whether something is misinformation or not is in the ear of the beholder. And so now sometimes, yes,
Right.
there's a very clear, okay, this is an out and out lie, and that's easier to identify. But there's not this clear border, right? So if somebody's expressing a strong opinion and stating it as fact, well, I mean, is that misinformation or not? It's hard. And as we said before, when we're talking about science, with new information, points of view change. So something that was misinformation 6 months ago isn't misinformation now, or vice versa. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's a devil of a problem. I think it's one of the reasons I'm not a politician. One of the many reasons is I feel kind of at a loss. And the things you have to do to get elected, I think, make it difficult for you to actually solve problems when you get in there because you've made promises, you have taken favors, or else you wouldn't be elected. And then you're kind of handcuffed.
Yeah, I'm reading the book Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari, and he makes a great point in that book that truth and facts are expensive, and lies and misinformation are cheap. It
Mhm.
takes a lot to effort and money to find out the facts of an issue. Um, I kind of wonder, as a society, if we need to start a conversation of like treating lies, misinformation, disinformation like a speeding ticket or a parking violation. Like, there will be a cost for you
Yeah.
violating. 'Cause I mean, it's not. I know this sounds crazy or dystopian, but I mean, but there's a lot of harm being done by the amount of disinformation and misinformation. And it's like if we don't get this under control somehow, we're just going to be in this. We're going to be like Russia, where nobody believes anything, which is a major problem when you're trying to solve issues and problems.
Well, and I think we're almost there. I think part of the problem we do have right now is we don't believe anything. I'm of an age where I can remember the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. And this was one of the things that was, it turned out you couldn't believe what the government was telling us. And that opened the gate to, well, they're not telling us the truth here. Where else aren't they telling us the truth? And I don't think we've ever recovered from that. I think up until that point, there was this sort of tacit agreement in our society that the government was kind of looking out for us and they're not going to come out right out and lie to us about stuff. Now, I'm, not speaking from the perspective of, an African American living in the South in the early 1900s or something like that. But um, I think now we're in this position where because you can't trust anything the government says, maybe they're not lying, but how can you tell? And so there's a complete lack of trust. I want to hang up my phone here. Somebody's calling
Sure,
me
sure.
there. Okay.
Does your work in the area of gossip, shed any light on lying and misinformation, disinformation?
I guess I hadn't thought about it before, but now that you mention it, one of the big motives for gossip, one of the real drivers of it is we need to figure out who we can trust and who we can't. We evolved in these societies where you really had to know what everybody was up to. You had to know who was sleeping with whom and who had powerful friends and who didn't, and who was going to take advantage of you and who wouldn't. And so it was constantly monitoring other people's moral character and reputation. And so gossip is all about, is this a person who can be trusted? And that's why we like scandals about money and sex, because it always shows somebody cheating someone, being disloyal to someone, and that allows us to make judgments about it. So we have a thirst for information that we can use to make these kinds of judgments. Unfortunately, a lot of the information we're getting today is misinformation. But because it's what we so desperately are seeking, we aren't as critically thinking about it as maybe we should. It sounds right. It confirms what I suspected, and I'm in.
Um, what about your work in intuition? What does that say about the people, the feeling that Trump gave them, even though you know he wasn't high on moral character, going with your gut and ignoring the horrible facts about him? What does your work on intuition say about that?
Yeah, well, intuition is getting back to the intellectual humility thing. If you're high in intellectual humility, you're a little suspicious of your intuition. Uh, not, I'm not suggesting our intuition is never correct, but our intuition did not evolve to give us an accurate picture of the world. Think of the way evolutionary pressure would have worked on our perception of the physical world. It's ruthless. If I can't tell whether there's a car or truck coming before I step out into the street, if I can't tell where the edge of that cliff is, if I can't tell whether that thing I'm about to pick up is a kitten or a rattlesnake, my genes are removed from the population pretty quick, right? But in the social world, the pressures are quite different. Uh, so our intuitions were shaped for things that would make us successful, not necessarily things that would give us an accurate portrayal of how the world was. So if I thought too carefully or nicely about my enemies, that might be something that would get in the way of what I might have to do in time of war or conflict. If I was too conscious of my own shortcomings and limitations, I might not strive as much as I otherwise would, and I'd be at a disadvantage there. If I thought the group that I was part of was not moral or trustworthy, then I would not be as loyal to them, and then I might get ostracized, and now I've got a problem. So our intuition has been shaped by things that have been useful for us, not things that necessarily show us what's really going on around us. And that's another thing that we're running into. I'm going to be using my intuition. I'm not really interested in knowing what's true. I'm interested in knowing what's useful for me.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm not conscious of that, but the feelings that I have that drive my voting behaviors and other such behaviors are that's where they're coming from.
Well, if you could pick your top three things that we need to do to make America a better place for all Americans, I know this is off the top of your head, but
Yeah.
what would the three things be if you were in charge?
Well, number one, in some way or other, we need more contact with people different from ourselves. And I don't mean necessarily, racially or age-wise different. I'm talking about sort of intellectually different. We do gravitate to people like ourselves. That's just human nature. And but part of the problem is we keep reinforcing what we think about everybody else. Whereas if you're working alongside people, having day-to-day casual conversations with them, and having civilized conversations about our differences, somehow we've got to set the stage for that to happen. It's you can't just have this contrived situation where you bring people together with the television cameras on them and say, okay, now have a conversation. It needs to be a much more informal, everyday sort of thing. So anything that would move us in that direction, I think would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of like your idea of having some sort of penalty for misinformation, at least for public figures who are willfully spreading it in a destructive way. If we can
Yeah.
concoct some legal way of dealing with that, I don't think we'll ever get to the point where, the local police officer can pull you over and say, well, I heard you said this to so and so last night, and that's wrong, so I'm going to write you a ticket. But for people who were on the big stage, uh, having some kind of consequence, the way they have in court, you'll notice.
I mean, we could change the libel laws for
Yeah,
sure.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, politicians like Trump can say anything they want at a rally, but they can't go into a court of law and take an oath and say that. And somehow, if we could get some sanctions, it used to be that we could I mean, you remember the day when politicians ruined their career by being caught in a lie or willfully spreading some kind of misinformation. it now almost seems like a valuable skill that we reward in politics. So yeah, I would say we need to deal with that as well. So more contact with dissimilar other people, consequences for willful spreading of misinformation, which is different from somebody who's just repeating something that they truly believe. I'm talking
Right.
about, getting the situation where somebody knows that they're causing trouble and they don't care.
Right. What about just the income inequality and, our tax codes, corporate, what corporations pay? I mean, that's an easy third item, I think.
It is, but boy, when you're in the individualistic capitalist system that defines what America is, you're going to have that spread of, you're going to have big winners and big losers. And you're right, as long as you've got that disparity, there's a tension that you don't see in a lot of other places where, okay, there's rich and poor everywhere, but the difference between them is not as profound as we see here. And so something like that would require essentially changing the whole system. And this is where one of the worst things that can be hurled at a Democratic candidate is socialist, right? So it's still kind of
And communist.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So this idea that I've got here in Galesburg, Illinois, there are signs you see all over the yards, 100% American, 0% socialist. And when I see the person out in the yard, an elderly person, I always want to ask them, well, do you accept Social Security? Are you on Medicare?
Do you pave
Um,
your own roads?
yeah, yeah, well, that's right. I mean, but they don't see that these are socialist systems. During our working life, we're paying money to support the older people. I think a lot of people think of this as sort of a savings account, that they've put this money away for themselves and they deserve it. They don't understand, the way it works. Um, and if you describe socialist programs without using the word socialist, I think a lot of times people say, well, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah,
But
there's a
yeah,
yeah. There's a famous interview. It's probably, I don't know, 8 or 10 years old. They asked a guy how if he likes his ACA, the American Health, and he's like, "Love my ACA. How do you like Obamacare?
oh,
Hate that."
yeah, yeah, yep. Yeah, I remember the nightmare of Obamacare, but there was
Yeah.
never any description of really what the nightmare exactly was, unless you were in the healthcare industry and were losing money because it existed.
Well, back to income inequality because that's part of the driver of the dissatisfaction or the disenfranchisement of working class Americans. Like that's part of a bigger problem. And until you solve that, it's going to be hard to talk to anybody about the Nix thing that, hey, we can improve on this as well. Um, I don't know if that's leadership or having a narrative
The
that
interesting
go,
thing,
hey, this is not a left right thing. This is the super wealthy against everybody else, and they're controlling the dark money. They're control, we get it if we can get some of the money out of politics, all the things that really people on the left want to do. I don't know why the people on the right that aren't super rich are opposed to this.
there's been an interesting alliance between the Elon Musks and the very wealthy people who just want lower taxes, and the working class people who also want lower taxes, but they don't understand that some people are profiting a lot more than they are from these tax cuts. And there's also I've seen some interviews with people who are Trump supporters, and they kind of like the idea that it's possible to get really rich. I mean, they almost like admire people for that and seem to hold on to the dream that maybe that could happen for them someday. So I don't think many Trump supporters are the very, very poor, the very destitute.
No, no, I
Uh,
mean, there's been
yeah,
stats that say they're
yeah,
they're
yeah.
not.
They're
It's not.
they're
They're
working
not
class
in the
people
Appalachia
who,
per se.
yeah, yeah,
There are
they,
those, but that's not the
yeah,
majority.
yeah. They have a comfortable life, and they're not rich, but they're getting by. So yeah, this income disparity thing, I agree, is a very big part of the problem, but people don't seem to recognize that.
Well, I think, AI and it's going to exacerbate that problem. And it's probably going to, hit white collar folks more than blue collar folks. And maybe that will be at a point in time where people's like, well, whether it's universal income or whatever it is like there's going to be a problem that it is going to require a whole different way of doing things, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and the super wealth, it's really a competitive thing. They don't need another $10 million, but
No.
it's like in professional sports when you see a player holding out for
That's
an obscene
270
number.
million versus
Yeah,
250.
yeah. What's really going on there? It's not really about the money. There's another player who got that. And if I accept less than that, I'm admitting I'm not as good as that person. And so the money is just a way of keeping score. And I think that's what's happening in the billionaire world as well. Trump is obsessed with being on the richest list and gets very thin-skinned about people thinking he's not as wealthy as he claims he is. So I think a lot of this is driven by that. Yeah.
Well, and I've got news for anybody listening. Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes have 10 Super Bowl championships together, and they've routinely taken less money so they could have better players around them.
Hmm.
So I guess, if you want to win, that's the way to do it. If you want to win championships anyway.
Yeah.
Um, Frank, anything else you want to touch on while I got you here?
And no, we've covered an awful lot of ground about stuff I didn't consider myself to be an expert on by any means, but it sure has been fun. And you've actually posed some questions I hadn't thought about before, which I found very helpful. Uh, but no, I don't have that nugget that, gee, I was really hoping we'd talk about this or,
Well, I think you feel like a lot of people, and myself included, is that it's you know, America after Trump, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? Um, there's not a lot of good answers right now, unfortunately. And I just want to start the conversation of like, hey, we've got to do something different. This is not sustainable.
no.
And
And,
whether it's go ahead. Sorry.
well, I was going to say, and as we said earlier, even if Trump goes away, that infrastructure is still there
Yeah.
to produce the next one. I'm really concerned about okay, we're talking as if Trump's going to lose the election. Immediately after Trump loses the election, the outrage from the not small number of people who once again are going to believe that he had the election stolen from him, that America is being taken away from him. I am quite concerned about that's uh, what's going to happen there. And it's not that I'm even that worried about the schemers who are spreading this information, the large number of people who will feel genuine rage because they think that cheating is going on. I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll know in a couple of weeks.
Now, you just reminded me of a question I did have for you that I haven't asked. What do you see happening to the Republican Party after Trump leaves?
That's a great question. And I'm not a political scientist. I don't pretend to have any great expert in politics. So much of Trump's success is this cult of personality. And I don't see anybody on the horizon right now who's going to be able to step right in and be Trump afterwards. So I think there's going to be this sense of sort of loss and a lot of shifting around. I think the party is going to have to morph into something else after Trump himself is gone. But I think he's certainly laid the groundwork for an authoritarian, misinformation
Strongman.
driven strongman kind of thing. Uh, they're going to have to find their next champion, whoever it might be. I don't think any of the people on the scene right now are going to have a chance of stepping in, but there's a
Do
young
you
Trump lurking out there somewhere.
do you think there's any chance that the Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger folks can wrangle back control? And if they do, don't they just lose all the MAGA folks? I don't,
The only way that happens is if somehow the MAGA people become convinced that they've been had. In other words, it's not just going to be enough for Trump to lose. He has to be exposed, whether it's through being convicted, through these various trials that he faces, or some news breaking in a way that his followers will believe. to see that the emperor has no clothes. I think that's the only way the Republican Party sort of gets back on track. If he goes to his grave a hero and a martyr, there's a long road to go down before things
Yeah,
change.
I'm curious if there's any work that you've done in the field of psychology that, informs what you think about, a post-Trump Republican Party.
Part of the problem is people are in so deep now. Cognitive dissonance. You've said so many of the things, you've behaved a certain way. To suddenly change course means publicly admitting, with a lack of intellectual humility, that I was wrong, that everything I did was for naught, or even worse than that, I did evil. And it's just really hard for people to do that. So that's why I'm worried, because I think even if people start to see cracks in Trump's armor and start to become disaffected with him, they themselves have now gone so far in that they're going to have to justify it in some way.
Yeah, it will be interesting for those, that's part of their identity, the MAGA movement, how they move, emotionally away from that or whatever happens next. I don't know.
It makes me think of what happens to religious cults when things don't work out. Like, they predict the end of the world is coming and they all gather and pray and get ready for eternity. And then, the day comes and goes and they're still here. You would think that'd be the end of it, right? That they'd fall apart, no, they find new ways to, okay, it was going to end, but God was impressed with their effort to pray and come together, that he spared the world, and they become heroes. The world didn't end because of what they did. And so we can do amazingly psychologically gymnastic things to make ourselves come out all right in the end. So stuff like that's going to happen if Trump goes down, and the problem doesn't go away.
Well, Frank, thanks for joining the podcast today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and learn from your research and experience. So I thank you very much.
Thank you. Best part of my day.
All right. Thanks, Frank.
Well, that was a real pleasure to talk with Professor McAndrews. His insight on the human condition is invaluable. Looking at how we got here through the lens of evolutionary psychology is very insightful and illuminating. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Thank you, take care, and have a great week.